Hey, so really, this is not my forte, and I said earlier today, I teach 5-year-olds, you guys, and so adults scare the mess out of me. But I am so excited for this. When this was brought to my attention, I had an opportunity to meet our 2 presenters in Chicago in October and talk about wow. Oh, was it a wow moment for me. Never imagined that we would have all these people in this room. I didn't know this many people could fit in this room. So thank you for supporting us here at UEA. I hope that you gain what I've gained and more. I'm going to turn the time over to Chelsea Acosta. She is a member of the EMAT committee. Chelsea was one of the NEA Social Justice finalists representing the state of Utah. So what an honor for us. So I'm going to turn the time over to her, and she's going to introduce our speakers.
Good afternoon. Wow, I feel like it's still morning. So I was honored last year to be nominated by Heidi and UEA for the Social Justice, NEA Social Justice Activist Educator of the Year, and 7 of us in the nation were actually considered finalists, and we went back to Boston for the national, or for the RA, and my life has been forever changed because of it, and for a couple of reasons. I formed a really close bond with Jenny Okerlund. Is Jenny in here? She's at the table, so we have to make sure we thank Jenny because she's done some amazing work. But really it was about meeting the other finalists from across the nation, that we share the same heart and soul and mind and walk a really fine line of employment. Where's Tracy? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Trace, our lawyer. Okay, sorry. And I have her on speed dial. So the most amazing experience of all of this was truly meeting Terry and Luke and forming just such a bond with them. And I'd like to just share the first time I met them, none of us knew each other from across the nation. It was just really amazing. And we got into Boston. It was a couple of nights before the RA. We met in this hotel lobby, and Harry Lawson, amazing Harry, and Merwin had us all assemble, their NEA Human and Civil Rights Department, and had us meet in the lobby to get to know one another. And it was the first time I had been to the RA, the first time these 2 had been to the RA, so we were already just excited about being in the RA. And we all sat around in this little circle, and we went around and kind of talked about who we were, where we were, what our issues were, what our passions were about. And we went all the way around, and these 2 were sitting behind me. And I was like, what is up with these 2? They're like 2 white guys in these Black Lives Matter shirts, and they're silent. Like, it's kind of awkward. Like, what's going on? And it got around all the way around, and Harry, big, beautiful black teddy bear Harry, says, well, are you 2 gonna go? I mean, and so he's like basically stating what some of us are thinking. And they paused, and in the most classy, respectful way that I think I've ever had a white male, we're gonna talk about race, so you just get comfortable really quick, respond, and they said, we were just making sure that every person of color got to go first, and that their stories were shared, and that every female had an opportunity to speak before we took up space and airtime. And that was the first time in 42 years that it was that respectful and deliberate. And it was an amazing experience. And from that moment on, I'm like, okay, you 2 own me. Like, whatever you have to say, I'm listening. And we have just formed an amazing connection, and I just really respect the work that they do. And I feel like when we talk about race, it's much easier to maybe sometimes not hear it from a person of color. That we really wanted to bring Terry and Luke here into our beautiful space of Utah, which is very much white, and have this conversation, because I feel like a lot of you will resonate and connect with it. So thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Harry. Jenny Okerlund, these 2 amazing brothers of mine, and thank you for providing the space. But this is Terry Jess and Luke Mitchner, and we thank their wives for lending them to us for the weekend. But I'm going to turn the mic over to them. Please give them a warm Utah welcome.
Well, I feel like we can just go home after that.
Yeah.
Chelsea took care of it all.
Thanks, Chelsea.
So yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, in addition to being educators, both history teachers in Bellevue, Washington, before and after models for Weight Watchers, we also consider ourselves to be anti-racist activists. And so we're going to try to go through and talk to you guys a little bit about lessons that we have learned and hopefully share those with you so that you can learn them a little bit easier than we did. And so a little bit of background about us. So I grew up in North Idaho, which is very, very white. And my dad was pretty racist. He said a lot of stuff. He always says, I'm not a racist, I'm a separatist, which by definition is racist. But that's what he always kind of put forth and had an idea. And I always remember resisting it and wanting to challenge it, not always knowing how, not always feeling comfortable doing it. But I always knew I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be racist. I wanted to be a non-racist. And that worked for a while. I moved to South Carolina, went to school for a bit, moved back to Idaho, did some more school. And while I was kind of wrapping up my master's degree is when I was first really challenged with the idea that it's not enough to be not racist. You need to be anti-racist. And so that started my journey as an educator now for 6 years. And then 2 years into my career, I got to meet this guy.
Yeah. So my name is Luke Mitchner. Again, social studies teacher. We both teach at the same high school in Bellevue, Washington. Go Wolverines. So shout out. So my first encounter with race was when I was in 3rd grade. I was 8 years old. And a little white guy at a Cub Scout meeting. I was in Cub Scouts all through Weeblos. Was that a clap or a oh? Yeah, Weeblos? Anyway. I can respect that.
Fair enough,
for sure. Yeah, fair enough. This is 3rd grade, and we're playing outside. And I grew up in a relatively diverse community. Friends of all colors. It's a beautiful place to grow up. But as a white child in that environment, I had learned somehow at 8 years old a word that meant something bad. Like if somebody did something bad, you might call them this word. It's a word that starts with N, and you can probably imagine what the rest of that word is. I'm not comfortable saying it anymore. And as an 8-year-old, I called another little white child this word when he took my soccer ball. I don't even remember what he did. He did something I didn't like, and I said, "Well, you're a N-word, right?" My mom heard it, and my mom's a lovely woman. She's wonderful. But she pulled me aside and scolded me for it, rightfully. Told me that that was bad, kind of explained what it meant and why I shouldn't use it. And from that moment on, I thought about race, maybe not as consciously as I do now, but I at least thought about race in the way I used language. And my first interaction with race was a negative one, too. It was one in which I had gotten in trouble for something. And so I think that sort of drove the next. I ended up being a history major in college. I studied African American history in some depth, the civil rights movement. I was an African studies minor in international studies in college. And I think a lot of that drove, from that moment, some curiosity about the history behind race. And like Terry, I tried to consider myself a not racist person by trying to understand that history and then teaching it. I've been teaching now for 12 years, 4 years with Terry at Bellevue High. But then that all changed in listening to some students' stories, hearing stories from students of color who were talking about their daily experiences in the building I taught in and how little representation they had in the daily experience at that school, at Bellevue High. And so from then on, I tried to think of my role less as just understanding the past and coming from a perspective of a not racist person to anti-racism, which is something we're going to get into in more depth in a few minutes, but to actually trying to do something about it, to try and change the narrative or do my part to change the narrative for students like the ones who were telling me their stories.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So just real quick, we're gonna do some definition work and talk through some definitions of words that pop up in these conversations a lot, and if you don't have a common understanding of what you're talking about, then you end up talking past one another because you have different operating definitions. So the first one, just kind of talk about, is anti-racism. Anti-racism includes beliefs, thinking, and action that seeks to oppose systemic and individual racism and the effects of racism on individuals. It seeks a truly egalitarian and just society. So this is active. Anti-racism is active work. If you are passive, but you don't harbor racist feelings, you don't make racist comments, but you're passive, that's not anti-racism, right? Anti-racism is very active in recognizing how things have developed over time. If you want more, I created a class in my district called Race in the US. It's a semester-long college and the high school class that students can take, and we talk about the social construction of race. Race has not always been a thing. Even when you go further back, slavery was not based off of race originally. It was mostly based on conquering other peoples, or class, or as a punishment for crime. It wasn't until the late 1500s, 1600s that race came into the picture and started to get defined. And we spent years, hundreds of years, getting to define what race meant. Who is considered what? The first laws that have white in them appear in the 1600s in Virginia, where they start to separate white versus that. Before it was Christian, right? They would use Christian to describe Europeans. But then we see the transition to skin color. All of that led into creating some systems in our country, just from a very base level. All men are created equal, is what our founders told us. But the only people that could vote were rich, landowning, white males. Not even poor white men, no men of color, and no women. And it took hundreds of years for us to rectify that, and it still isn't completely rectified. There are issues with voting today that intentionally tries to prevent voting by persons of color, persons in poverty, so on and so forth. So it's looking at those systems and actively opposing them.
Okay. So we, at our school, Bellevue School District, I'm really proud of actually, is taking a really active role in working toward a racially equitable experience for our students. We're early in the work. We're just starting, and we don't come here with a bunch of answers for how to solve the problems. Let me just start by saying that. But we do come here as people who've tried to start engaging in coming up with solutions to some of the problems. And one of the tools that our school district has put in front of us comes from the Pacific Education Group, which is credited over there. And it's, yeah, they have a series of protocols to follow for having conversations that center race as the focus of those conversations. So as leaders in your schools, I want to point you toward them as a potential resource that you could look at. But this is called Courageous Conversations About Race, is what they call that program. And these are some norms that they have established and that we're going to try to use in the room today. They call them the 4 agreements. So the first of those 4 is to speak your truth. We all have lived experiences. We're all in this room. We've all taught our teachers. We've all had educational experiences. We've all walked through life and speak from that perspective. That's your truth. That's the perspective that you bring to a discussion. Speak your truth is not about what is fact versus what is a lie. That's not necessarily what speak your truth about. It's about honoring other people's points of view and knowing that we're all coming from a different place. But we're in this room now and we're trying to center race in a discussion about justice in education. Do you want to say anything else there?
No, nailed it.
All right.
Okay. The second norm or agreement that we hope all of you can make in this 2 to 3 hours that we have together is to experience discomfort. You may already have felt discomfort, and you may have already pushed yourself to sit in that by signing up and showing up. That I appreciate it. It's a difficult topic to have conversations about. A lot of times you're going to feel things, right, and feel like talking about this means that you're talking about me personally or something I've done. And then all those feelings start to come in of shame or guilt or frustration or anger because you disagree or whatever it may be. Everybody has a different point that they're going to reach that. And if you're willing to sit in that discomfort, to own it, you will get better in those conversations. It will get easier. and you will get a deeper understanding. Doing this work is about being uncomfortable all the time. And if that sounds unfair, just I want to acknowledge that if you are a person of color in this country, that is their status quo. And so I would ask as a white person to engage in this work, you're willingly going into the discomfort that our colleagues of color, our students of color experience on a daily basis.
And when you're at that point of discomfort, it's really important, well, at any point, but especially when you're at that point of discomfort, to stay engaged. Staying engaged means choosing, thinking about what's going on in your head, kind of metacognating a bit on what your thoughts are, and then choosing to continue to stay engaged in the work, even though you might be uncomfortable. You might be experiencing some discomfort. And in a professional development setting like this, or when you're working in your teams back in your districts or in your buildings, you're sitting around a table group and having a conversation and it goes a different direction than you're comfortable with. I do this. I'm quick to grab my phone and disengage. Get on Twitter, get on Facebook. Maybe have my laptop open and stop listening. Those are the sort of passive acts of disengagement that are the most damaging, I think. And it's important not only to stay in the room, but to also stay connected when you're in the room to the folks who are trying to tell you something. Whether you agree with it or not, it's important to stay engaged and experience the discomfort.
And it's not always visible. My go-to when I get uncomfortable is to make a to-do list in my head. I have a lot of other things going on. Maybe I felt are more important than what's happening in this conversation. I get frustrated with the lack of progress that's taking place. And when people are sharing their discomfort of why it's taking a long time, I want to discount that. But I also need to stay engaged in that. Finally, we're going to ruin the entire thing because we're going to ask you to expect and accept non-closure. We will not solve racism by 3 o'clock. And I know that's tough, right? This is something that we really want to tackle and we want to see it in. I don't think there's a person in this room, that's an assumption we're going to make, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but I don't think there's a person in this room that wants to see anybody treated differently because of their skin color. I hope that's a fair assumption to make. But we're not there. And we're not going to get there in the next 3 hours. We're not going to get there by the end of this school year, but we can make progress. So accept non-closure, but also keep pushing in this work.
All right. So I know this is, I actually teach a class on how to give presentations.
How not to do this?
Man. Yeah, this wouldn't get a good grade. But there's a reason why that entire text is there. And I'm going to kind of stand off to the side so you can see the screen. This is from Webb Du Bois, who is a historian, studied sociology, history. He's brilliant, studied at Fisk University, which is a beautiful place in Nashville, Tennessee, if you get a chance to go visit. He wrote in 1934, 34, 35, about Reconstruction, which was the period right after the Civil War. It's a book called Black Reconstruction. If you haven't visited that text, please do, it's beautiful. In his preface, he says this, so I'm gonna just read this to you now. It would be only fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person toward this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in a modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sorts of facts that I have set down. But this latter person, I am not trying to convince. I am simply pointing out these 2 points of view, so obvious to Americans, and then without further ado, I am assuming the truth of the first. In fine, I'm going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude will from the first seriously curtail my audience. What Du Bois is saying here is, if you don't believe in humanity, in the humanity of a person of color, to use 21st century language, then you're not going to believe anything we have to say. Anything I have to say in this book, Black Reconstruction, or anything we have to say today. There's a belief that that there's inferiority among the races. And if that is your value system, then the rest of this will be meaningless to you. And to illustrate that point, we brought a little bit of data with us. This comes from the Sentencing Project, which is focusing on incarceration, mass incarceration. And this is some data that they provide. And I'll just point out a couple of things here. I'm going to point to the stat about black men. This is that 1 in 3 black men in this country in the 21st century will spend time in jail and prison on probation or parole. And the same for white men is 1 in 17 will spend time in jail and prison on probation or parole. And my point in illustrating this is to go back to Du Bois' idea, to think about if there is some sort of inferiority, that might be the reason we see this, that black men are simply more criminal than white men. It's a pathology, right? It's race based on race. And that's not true. That's not what we believe. We believe that people are equal and that the systems that are in place are the reason why this outcome is the result. It's not anything wrong with blackness. It's not anything wrong with being Latinx. Those aren't the reasons why we have criminalized those folks more than white folks.
And this starts in our schools. If you're not unfamiliar with the phrase, the school to prison pipeline, I encourage you to get, I think there's a training coming up on that the UEA is part of. This is the idea that we start criminalizing blackness or brownness at a very young age, right? And there's plenty of studies, we're not going to go into all of them, but there's plenty of studies that you can look up that show how black and brown students are disproportionately disciplined at far younger ages. Look at the expulsion or suspension rates in preschool. By 4 years old, the trajectory can already be set. Not because of the actions of the student, but because of the perpetuation of the system that will continuously punish them, criminalize them, until they internalize it and believe it themselves.
And that plays out here.
Which leads us to?
Some data about Utah. So we bring this with you, and we want to fully acknowledge that a similar graph would reveal the same data about Washington State, where we're from. This isn't brought to you in sort of an accusatory way.
Yeah.
It's just meant to illustrate the same idea, but in our context. These are Utah graduation rates by race as of 2012, with some of the later data that we could find. So by race, the graduation rate for white folks in Utah was 83%, for Asian Pacific Islanders, 78%. And then for Latinx and black folks, it was in the 60s, 66 and 64 respectively. And we want to bring Du Bois back into the conversation and say that we don't think that's because black and brown students are inferior. That's not where we come from, and we'd like to believe that everybody in the room isn't coming from that place either. Therefore, the rest of this presentation is for you. If you are coming from that point, you won't agree with anything we have to say today. If you think we can do better, then we're going to try to offer some ways to think about, especially from a white perspective, things we can do better.
And I do want to challenge you, because it's really easy when we see data like this to start rationalizing it, to ask about poverty, to ask about English language learners, to ask about special ed. But when you disaggregate the data, all of that, we did this in our building, we did it in our district, take all of those factors out, this disparity remains, which means it is about race. Now, it may not be actively about race in your mind as we do this, right? It's a systemic issue, not an individual issue. Individuals contribute to the system, but this is a system. So like Luke said, if you believe we can do better for our students of color, then I hope you get something out of today.
One of Pacific Education Group, they go beyond those 4 norms that we talked about. They also have some other conditions, and one of them is to isolate race. And we're going to ask that you do that today in your minds. We're going to try to do that as well. Terry talked about that with poverty and other factors we might consider. We're entirely going to isolate race in this next couple of hours and hope that you take time and space in your own places to have those conversations as well.
So a few more terms. You taking prejudice, or am I?
I think I am.
You have it, yeah. Go ahead.
Taking prejudice? That sounds weird.
Are you prejudiced, or am I? Go ahead.
Thanks, Terry. Okay. So we're going to look at some terminology here and try to build sort of a foundation for where the rest of this day is going to go. So we'll start by defining what prejudice is, and it's internal. That's the thing to really take away about prejudice. It's things that we've learned, often subconsciously, that we carry with us as we walk through the day. You know, it may be the reason we've chosen to cross the street to walk on the other side of a group that's coming towards us. It might not be an active thought process, but it's been something that's been built up in us. And we learn those through songs, through things we've heard through relatives. Terry tells some powerful stories about that. Sports, movies, advertising, etc.
Yeah. And it's important, he mentioned this, and you may have heard the phrase implicit bias. Harvard came out with these implicit bias tests a long time ago, and every time people take it, they usually get shocked. Because prejudice doesn't have to be active, right? It can be something that's ingrained. It's just what we go to in our mind because that's how we've been conditioned to behave. And unless you actively challenge it, that becomes your default, your status quo.
Yeah, sorry, I have to history nerd a little bit.
No, go ahead.
We've got a little bit more time today, which is great.
Go ahead.
One of the first feature films, the first feature film ever in American history is called Birth of a Nation. I don't know if you're familiar with it or if you've ever seen it. There's a more modern version of it that kind of flips the script. It's really interesting about Nat Turner. But Birth of the Nation is about 100 years old now. In fact, I think it was 1919. It's about 100 years old, and it's about the Ku Klux Klan and celebrates the Ku Klux Klan and vilifies blackness. And from that, like that is the establishment of the motion picture industry in the United States, is a film that vilified blackness. That's the people who went to see Birth of a Nation and were in awe of the moving picture and all this technology, were sitting in a theater where the Ku Klux Klan was being celebrated and blackness was being vilified. The black characters were rapists. They were dangerous. They were murderous, etc. And so from that moment, we see popular culture in the United States, not just from that moment, but as an example, we see popular culture in the United States for a long time and continuing to vilify blackness and other people of color too.
So if prejudice is internalized, and it's what we think, and even unconsciously or subconsciously what we're thinking and how that affects our behaviors, let's go over to behavior. Discrimination is when your prejudice becomes external. When you act on discrimination against another person, then we get to discrimination. So this can be excluding people from your group, your friend, your union.
Hiring practices?
This could be avoiding. Sorry, I'm going to go back a bit. Everybody in the room realizes that African Americans were not admitted to the National Education Association for quite a while. Okay, all right. I just want to make sure, like when we talk about this stuff, we are not exempt from these processes.
And we are NEA members. We own that too.
Yeah, I've been to give my union creds. So I've been to our state council. I've been to the national. I've been a building rep. I've served on multiple committees. I believe in the power of the NEA, and that's why we come with this training to so many different NEA pieces, is because I believe that the NEA has the power to change the rhetoric and to change the outcomes in our schools. Avoiding, ridiculing, favoring. This is one that plays out in schools a lot. Students have talked to me about being a student of color in a class and raising their hand, not getting called on, and then another student feels, even if it's not intentional, even if it's unnoticed by the white student or the teacher, that's their truth. That's what they were experiencing. They felt that they were not being favored and that others were. Segregating, separation. I encourage you to look at the data of your gifted programs to find segregation. Not trusting, not giving that implicit trust that we give to others because it's a person of color. Not valuing their expertise, thinking that, well, it's because they're black. No, it's because they did a doctoral study and have been studying this for years and living it for even longer, right? Like, trust that. Attacking is obviously the word. When you get to violence, something like that, that's the worst. Now the problem is, a lot of times we boil racism down to this. Racism is attacking another person in a discriminatory way based on our prejudice. But that's not racism. It is racism, but it's not all of racism. Racism is an all-encompassing system that works on multiple levels and results in the unequal distribution of resources between white people and people of color. Overall, with whites as the beneficiaries of that. Now, does every single white person, does that mean that they're all wealthy? Does it mean that they didn't have to work for anything? Absolutely not. But what it is saying is that in any given situation, I was a teen parent. I had my first child when I was 16. I grew up in poverty. If there was an exact same situation, same upbringing style, same beliefs instilled, same mess-ups that led to it, I didn't take school seriously. Statistics show, racially predictable statistics show, that if I was black, I would not have gotten to where I was. Now, that doesn't mean that a person can't. It just means that it's a little bit easier for me because of the assumptions people make about me because of my skin color. So that leads us to kind of the word oppression.
All right. So oppression is where you take prejudices that have been built, often subconsciously, and combine them with group power, a group power dynamic. It's backed by legal authority and institutional control. Rules, laws, policies are made out of group control based on prejudices that individuals brought into that group setting. That is the term we're going to use. Oppression is the term we're going to use to describe that situation. And it is the long scope of American history. The first enslaved people were brought here in 1619. That was 399 years ago. In that moment where, as Terry mentioned earlier, slavery was defined on racial lines, we made deliberate decisions, and I say we, I know we weren't there, but from that moment on, deliberate decisions were made by that group in power who had prejudices based on a racial identity that they were empowered to design and define that would then last the 399-year trajectory to this room, to where we are, and to the space we do have control over. And that group power, combined with the prejudice, is what's really, really dangerous. And what we're going to try to talk about today of deconstructing. That's what anti-racism work tries to shift the power dynamic so that an entire structure of folks who are in charge of making decisions are coming from different points of view and can counter each other's prejudices.
And if you're interested, I encourage you to go to New York Times has a piece that talks about this type of power. And it looks at the racial breakdown of those in the US Senate, US House of Representatives, the history of our presidents, CEOs, those who choose what music gets produced, those who choose what movie gets produced, right? It goes all the way down. Those who choose what advertisements go out. You can see this in every level. What is shown as beautiful in our society? Who wins people's most beautiful person? You can count on your hand, maybe less, how many people of color have won the most beautiful person in the entire history of that magazine, right? So all of that is what we're saying is going into this systemic or institutional racism, right, when we talk about that. All right. Last piece that we want to get into, and then we're going to get you moving a little bit because I know you guys have been sitting and I'm already kind of antsy. So this is borrowed from Robin DiAngelo as well. When I teach race in the US and when I have conversations with students, ever since the civil rights movement, being racist is considered bad. Before that, it was perfectly acceptable. There were plenty of church-going, God-fearing people that were Klansmen. It was part of our society. But after the civil rights, it became morally wrong to be racist. And so as a society, we developed what Robin DiAngelo and I refer to as the false binary. You are either a bad racist person, and we often classify those as ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, old, a lot of times.
That will die off, that sort of language.
Yeah, racism will die off or has died off. And then a lot of times Southern, as if there's no racism north of the Mason-Dixon line. And then not racist is a good person. They are educated, which everybody in this room is. They are progressive, not necessarily politically, but progressively minded. They're open to change. Well-intentioned, young, northern/western. Northwest, Pacific Northwestern. Yeah, especially Pacific Northwestern. I think Oregon and Washington, right? And so this is the binary that we set up. And we define our lives by it because I'm not a racist person. And so let's bucket it, right? If it's only two things, we can have two buckets. One is the bad racist bucket. The other one is the good not racist bucket. So let's have a quiz. Hitler is a bad racist. Dr. Martin Luther King. Yeah, good not racist. Goes in the bucket. Ooh. Bad racist. What about you? Which bucket do we want to be in? We define ourselves when we look at that. I don't think there's, that's our assumption, right? Going back to the assumption. There's not a person in this room that looks in the mirror and says, I want to be in that other bucket. So we put ourselves in the good, not racist bucket. And we strive for that. Now this binary, where it really starts to fall apart though, is what happens when you do something, say something, and you get this response. You're racist. Immediately, you're going to enter cognitive dissonance. No, this doesn't fit with what I know. There's this bucket, and there's that bucket. I'm in that bucket. You obviously don't know that because you told me I'm racist, and you're saying I'm in this bucket, but I'm actually in that bucket. And then we get angry, we get nervous, we get guilty.
We disengage.
We disengage. Yeah. We got to get past the binary. Racism is not a binary of good and bad. It is a spectrum.
And it is a system.
And it is a system.
Right.
So the spectrum of both the system and individual, right? At any given time, we all fall somewhere on the spectrum. And at any given point in our lives, we will move in that spectrum. We may do something that's pretty overtly racist. It may have been unintentional. It may have been in the heat of the moment. But we may say something, do something that's pretty overtly racist, and we move down that spectrum. But then we might be doing some really important work around this issue, helping students of color, listening to our colleagues of color, and that puts us at a different place on the spectrum. We're not fixed. Nobody is fixed in this journey. Hopefully we're all growing, but at the very least we're not fixed. So, based off our thoughts, our words, actions that directly contribute to these systems of power and privilege. Can also be unintentional or unnoticed, right? I have said things that go unnoticed. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. Do I want to do it now?
No, I'll save it for later.
I'm going to save it for later.
Yeah.
We'll get it in. All right. So Hitler, we're talking about the spectrum. Sure, yeah, let's put him as far on the bad, he's pretty low on that spectrum, right? But then when it comes to us, we have to recognize that at any given moment, yeah, you guys know I like animations, yeah? We're moving along the spectrum, okay? We're moving along that spectrum. And I hope that your goal is to move towards a more anti-racist perspective, right? Not racist, anti-racist, racist. It's kind of a spectrum that goes through. You don't have to be fully racist to be not racist, right? And to get to anti-racist doesn't mean that you're cured of racial bias. Because I teach this workshop does not mean that I cannot implicitly assume something, see something, or think something about one of my students. It can still happen. You don't arrive. There is no non-racist good bucket that you get to hop into and feel cozy in. Sorry. All right, which brings us finally, 40 minutes. I think we were trying to keep that to 30, so we're a little behind. But brings us to the primer or primer, if you're English. We've been having this debate about just the word.
Tomato.
Is it primer or primer? I say primer, he says primer. He says tomato, I say tomato.
Yeah. Let's call the whole thing off, Terry.
But anyway, so we came up with this primer, which, as you know, probably from learning how to teach reading, is the basics. These are the basic key concepts that are needed to get into learning how to read or whatever. This is the basics of getting into this work. This is 101, right? This is anti-racism 101.
So when we were in Boston last June, we met Chelsea there and a whole host. We met Karen there. Where's Karen at? She's somewhere in the room. Hi, Karen. We met Heidi there too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anyway. Hey, everybody. We didn't know we were going to be asked to share something. We just thought, we're going to be there, meet these cool people, have a great experience. And then the day before this kind of smaller conference on racial equity in schools, we were asked to share some thoughts on how we had got to that point. We were nominated as 2 white guys for an award on social justice activism, and kind of feeling some kind of way about that. Like, well, why are we here? There's this really wonderful, especially women of color who have done some phenomenal work who deserve this, and what can we offer? And so we just met in Terry's hotel room for a few hours and thought through our experiences a bit, and that turned into this primer. That turned into this way of thinking as white educators that might give you a framework for how you might engage as white educators in your local or in your school, or at the state level or the national level. There are so many ways to engage, and that's culminated in why we're here today, to share that primer with you.
So as we get started, we're actually going to start with number 3 in our primer because we're teachers and that's what we do.
And I think you have sheets at your table.
Yeah, you have sheets at your table,
that outline this.
I believe. That if you want to take notes, you're welcome to.
Don't feel obligated. We're not collecting homework and giving grades. But if you'd like
we will be putting you in buckets at the end of this based on your notes. No. But if you feel so moved and necessary, please do take notes. So acknowledge is actually number 3. But we start with it because, as Luke said, we were really struck when we were asked to present about this of what do we have to offer, what do we have to share. Because everything that we've learned, everything that we've done, the catalyst has been our students of color. And our other students, but our students of color, their stories are what moved us to move from not racist to anti-racist, right? Who challenged us that we can do more as an educator. And so we want to first start by acknowledging that there are, our students of color. I'd name them, but you don't know who they are, so. But a lot of our students
Scotty,
of color. Yeah.
Morgan, I'll say some names in case they're watching.
Yeah. Scotty, Morgan, Mustafa. But there's also a lot of people that have been doing this work. Luke mentioned that when we were nominated for the award, we actually considered whether we should even accept the nomination. Because there are people that have been doing this work for a long time that have gone unacknowledged. There are people that not only is this their lived experience, but they've been doing it professionally in education for a long time. At that point, we had been actively engaged in this work for 3 years. Yeah. And yet we are already being recognized at a national level for doing the work. And I don't think that's right or fair. We wrestled with that for a long time, and I think for better out of what ended up coming out of it, but we decided to go because of the students that helped nominate us. And we wanted to honor that they wanted us to be a part of that. And so we kind of followed through with that, and we also thought it'd be a great opportunity to network. But this work has been going on. There's people in this room that are doing this work and have been doing this work for a long time. And Chelsea is one of them, right? Across the nation, the other activists, Jess Matthews in Flint, Michigan, Erica in Baltimore, Kay down in Florida, they've been doing this work for a long time. And there's plenty of other people that were not nominated that deserve credit for this. And so the importance of this is basically nothing you do is new, right? Nothing we do is new. We packaged it in a new way, but everything we've learned has already been out there. And so don't take credit for things that you don't deserve credit for. And we don't deserve credit for this, so that's why.
Yeah. We've also taken ideas, and we'll try to give credit for those as well, from thinkers, folks who've, like Webb Du Bois earlier in our history, but folks today, some of my favorite names are Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson. There's a long list of folks, Ta-Nehisi Coates. There's a long list of folks who have been national kind of thought provokers in discussions about race for a long time, and a lot of our learning came from them as well, and we'll try to acknowledge those voices too.
Try to give credit where it's due as we go. We're kind of bad about that as teachers. I don't know if you are, I am. I need something for my class, I search it online, see if it's already there so I don't have to reinvent the wheel, and then I drag and copy, and paste it in, and it's good to go. And we don't always give credit where it's at, so we're asking you to give some credit. But the number one on our primer is listen. Listen is, the reason it's number one, it is this absolute foundation. There is nothing that we have done in our racial equity work in our building, our district, that didn't start with us hearing stories. We have to value storytelling. We have to value the truth that's coming there. And we have to hear our students, our colleagues of color, because they will tell you what their truth is if you're willing to listen. And if you're willing to act on that listening, which we'll get to later. But this is not a passive thing. You're not sitting there getting paid I don't know, what do psychologists make nowadays? $300 an hour. That seems low. To be a passive recipient, right? You should be actively engaged in listening. We teach our students this. We don't want them to be passive and just acquiescent to what we're doing. We want them to be engaged. When other students speak, you engage, you look at them, you nod, you show that you are engaged and that you are a part of it, and that it's working in your brain. It may not change everything completely, but you're allowing it to process and go through that.
Yeah, and not to put the cart too far ahead of the horse, but this also shows up when you do something with what you've heard. And so we'll talk a little bit more about action later, but...
so let's practice.
Yeah.
We're going to ask you to partner up with somebody. Do we want them to partner up at their table? They know everybody at their tables. No? Okay, this isn't the other thing. Last time you guys were sitting by like your UNICEF councils.
Yeah, this is different.
But yeah, so find a partner, can be next to you. We're going to ask you to sit facing one another knee to knee. Thank you for demonstrating this. That's so nice of you.
Yeah, look at that.
So you're going to sit knee to knee with one another. You know, feel free to leave. You know, I always tell
they don't have to be touched.
I
Knees don't have
kind of joke around the kids at dances. You know, leave 8 inches for Jesus. So you can leave some space there. You can leave some space, but I want you sitting knee to knee, and I want you facing them.
Supposed to find something we don't know?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, because you may never heard this about them, and it may give you new learning.
Yeah, I don't think that's
once you find it, decide who's 1 and 2, or A and B if you don't like numbering. And what we're going to do is person 1, so as you start finding a partner, you can start thinking about this. Both people are going to end up sharing a moment of their racial autobiography. And what we're going to ask you to share is the first time you realized racial difference existed or mattered.
Yeah. There's some educator lingo here. Terry and I modeled that for you earlier in the discussion when we talked about our kind of first times we recognized race.
Okay.
We're asking you to try to think back in your brains about when that first time was for you.
So I'm going to give you 60 seconds to think about that, find a partner, and sit next to them. So finish your last thought sentence. I feel like I'm talking lower into my chest here. Finish your last thought sentence. All right, now, person B, you listened. You actively listened to what they had to say. You may have some questions or some things that you want to know. I'm going to ask you not to relate or tell a story, but you may ask questions. Some prompts for you. Good way to always start is what I heard you say was, and then ask the question. One, that affirms that you heard what they said. It also gives them the chance to correct misconceptions, because sometimes what I say is not what you hear. What did you mean when you said this? What feelings or thoughts did you have when it happened? What feelings or thoughts do you have about it right now? All right, so you have 2 minutes to engage each other. Person B, you get to start with the questions. Go. Go ahead and finish your last sentence there.
There it is.
There we go.
That's one way to get their attention. Be awkward. We're going to reiterate the accept and expect non-closure agreement here and know that you've probably got a lot more to say there, and then encourage you to re-engage in those discussions when you have a chance.
Time to flip.
We're going to flip now.
So person B, you are now going to share your moment when you first realized racial difference. You already did? Go deeper. If you don't make it to 2 minutes, just go ahead and sit and enjoy staring at each other. And go. Okay. I have a second microphone in my hand, which I don't know what that's doing to the sound, but I would like to just ask a very basic question. and get a few people to share out, what do you notice? Somebody like...
Well, we're going to bring you a mic so that the camera hears you.
Old people are down here.
Okay, so maybe some of this seems logical because, you know, the older you are, the further back you go. But I see some older, younger, less younger people on that side. All right, what is another notice?
I saw it.
Okay, coming over that way.
I'm just gonna talk really loud.
Okay.
I noticed that it's the entire spectrum.
Oh, but we're post-racial, aren't we?
We've had a black
that
president.
isn't that the narrative that we hear? And even if we don't believe that fully, isn't that the narratives that sometimes we reinforce when people of color tell us their truth? It's not that bad. Slavery's over. My ancestors didn't own slaves. Civil rights movement fixed it. Yes.
We're just saying it's not over, obviously.
And it's
There for us, but it's still there for them.
We can repeat answers, yeah.
yeah. Okay, so the notice was that the spectrum goes all the way. It's not over.
It's not over.
They experienced something. May I ask how old you were when you experienced that?
Me?
Sure.
I was probably 2 or 3.
2 or 3. Is there anybody over here that experienced it under the age of 5? Yeah, there are. So what does that tell us? We're not post-racial, and we have work to be doing.
Right.
Any other notices quick before I let you go back to your seats? Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, one more share over here.
Hi, this is intimidating. So mine's 2014, and I'm really embarrassed to be way, way, way over here. But I was thinking we were in like a post-racial, it doesn't matter what color you are world until one of my friends adopted a child of color in 2014, which is the same year that I had my sweet little white child. And that is what made me start realizing how different her experience, she's white, she's a white mother of a black child, and her experience is so different because her child is a different color, and that's when I finally went, oh, there's a problem, and if I love this family, which I do, I need to find a way to fight on the right side. So I am really sad that I'm way over here in 2014. But at least I'm in 2014 and not 2018.
All right, thank you.
I was afraid that there might be somebody in the room that this, when I told you you were white, was the first racialized experience you had. All right, thank you. You guys can go ahead and head back to your seats. I use it sometimes when I facilitate difficult conversations where we have strongly agree to strongly disagree, and students are able to visually put themselves on the spectrum. So feel free to use that. Yes?
One thing I kind of wanted to mention, Trevor, over there, is that over here.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
It looked like you had to get pretty far over before you started seeing people of color. And I think part of that is having gone to, being older. It was, my whole school experience were white teachers. Yeah. And so you had to go pretty far in Utah before you started seeing teachers of color.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. All right, thanks again for just participating in that. You're showing vulnerability even just by taking a spot on the line. You're engaging. We really appreciate that. We know that, and this is something we'll talk a little bit later about too, as one of the primer principles, but that may have been uncomfortable in some of your own self-realizations, and sitting with the discomfort and processing that is where we find growth, where we learn. And so we'll spend some more time in that and just appreciate people's willingness to go there.
One other observation I have.
We need to be on, I know, we can hear you, but the camera might not.
The one thing that I think I noticed watching from the outside is that we only had one person of color speak during that. So Cindy spoke, thank you, Cindy. But also, what kind of space are we creating that only one person of color felt comfortable sharing their story during that? Just another random observation.
Thanks, Chelsea.
I will tell you my story really quickly, because it's a different kind of...
Can we get you a mic real quick?
My first time that I discovered that there was a difference between colors is my parents.
I am of mixed heritage. I am half white and half black. And so, right on, Eddie. So the way that I knew there was a difference in color was when I realized that my mom was white and my dad was black. So understand that that's out there, that's real. That's a real experience.
All right. Thank you once again, everybody, for sharing your truth and for sitting in that. And thank you, Chelsea, for bringing attention that we do want to make sure that we create space. If you're willing to share, we would love to hear from you. And so sometimes step back. We'll get to that in a minute, too. All right. So we did listen. We've done acknowledge. Number 2 is learn. And we're going to do another activity with this. So learning is really about not putting the burden on people of color to educate you about racial issues. Now, hearing their stories, hearing their truths, yes. You put in the legwork to have a relationship, a friendship with a person of color, and you want some clarity on something, yes. But this is not every time something comes up with race, going to the one person of color that you know and asking them to explain, hey, explain this Black Lives Matter stuff to me because I don't really get it, okay?
You can read about Black Lives Matter.
To do it. There's lots and lots and lots of resources available for you to learn.
Yeah, what's DACA? Well, go talk to so-and-so. Well, we can learn about DACA and have some ideas about what we might share with that student. That doesn't mean we're the expert, but we've put in some groundwork to at least have some understanding of what that program might be.
It also speaks to the assumption that because my colleague is a person of color and you're asking me about something that I think pertains to people of color, the assumption is it doesn't impact you and that all persons of color's experiences is the same. And that's not the case. So what we're going to do to kind of get into the need for learning is we're going to teach a brief history lesson. Sorry.
We're history teachers.
But that's what we do.
That's where we go.
So on your sheet is a large piece of paper. Don't worry, this is a group activity.
On your table.
In the middle of that piece of paper, I would like you to write the name Rosa Parks. If you don't know how to spell that, that's R-O-S-A. And this is Utah, so you should know how to spell parks.
Lots of parks. Just small enough to work around it. We're going to kind of web some ideas together.
What? Webbing it? Yeah.
Okay. We haven't given any yet. Just Rosa Parks. That's
second piece of instruction. Yeah. So you all have your table, you all have your paper, you all have Rosa Parks written on that. You have 90 seconds to write down everything you know about the story of Rosa Parks.
Bullet points.
All of you. All of you.
Yep. Pass out markers. You can say ideas. What do you know?
All right, I'll give you 2 minutes. Markers down. Okay. I know you want to put something else or something's ruminating, but time is up. All right. Luke is going to come around and ask people to share out facts or information, and I'm going to be recording up here what you say, and then hopefully we'll have a point to it at the end.
Does anybody want to start? Something you know about Rosa Parks or her story? Yeah, we're just going to race around the room.
That it was planned. It was planned for her to get arrested that day.
All right. It was planned.
She sat in the third row of the bus, and she was allowed to sit in the third row, and the person that came in and sat down in the third row was white and forced her to move, and she refused.
Thank you. Denise. Yeah.
She was a strong-willed woman.
That's the truth right there. Any other facts to share? Oh, you're next.
She was willing to set an example and be a leader.
Thank you, Brian.
This led to the boycott, And Dr. King came in at age 26, which is really remarkable to kind of to be a leader of the boycott.
Well, the obvious, she was black.
Yeah, we can go there. See Chelsea. Charlotte, I'm coming. This is a hard room to race around in.
She was a active civil rights activist and did a crap ton even before the bus incident.
Yep.
This crowd knows too much.
Yeah, the activity's not working. No, it's okay.
Yeah,
It's okay.
she was sent to jail for standing up.
I'm gonna get exercise today. Yeah.
She was not the first black woman that protested. Colvette Colvin was the first black woman to protest on a bus.
She was 15. Any other? Oh, there's something over there. Excuse me.
For us at the table, she's the first black woman activist that we're aware of in the civil rights movement, so that plays to what Chelsea said.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share a thought? Of course, you're on the other side of the room. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's all right. I'm going to hold the mic for you.
She was sent by the NAACP to investigate the rape of Racy Taylor.
Yeah.
It's okay. Well,
Thank you.
These are impressive.
Yeah, it's not working, Terry.
It's okay. We're still going to make the point. I saw some other stuff on boards that have not been shared yet. And so I saw one that said that she was tired after a long day. Hold on. It's okay. I'm not saying it's untrue. I'm saying it's.
I'm not saying it's true.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yep. Yes.
That's what I was taught when I was a kid, was she was just tired and she didn't want to give up her seat. She'd been a maid and she'd been working on her feet all day.
Can I ask you?
That's not, I know that's
Yeah.
not true.
Can I ask
but-
you, as a child and you learned that lesson, how old was she in your mind?
She was old.
Old woman.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she was old and tired and just couldn't move anymore.
Thank you.
Basically.
So you guys did ruin the activity.
Yeah.
But
We know there's probably more to say.
But what we do in this space usually is we have some very well-educated people here that have clearly taken the time to learn the full story. But when we talk about learn, a lot of times we use the iceberg metaphor, and I got to give credit to Pacific Education Group for above the line and below the line. What is the above the line story that we're taught? Because you can wrap it up, the entire civil rights movement of what has predominantly been taught to students is Rosa sat and Martin stood. And then racism was over. Okay? That's narrative. But the narrative that we were taught about Rosa Parks. I am 32. I was graduated in 2003. So the narrative I was taught. What?
High school?
Graduated high school in 2003. Yeah, sorry. The narrative I was taught is that Rosa Parks was an old black woman who sat down on the bus, was told to move, and because she was so tired after a long day of being a seamstress, she refused to get up, and because of that, she was arrested, and it started the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, you guys hit a lot of the below the line stuff.
Yeah, you did.
Pretty impressive, actually.
Yeah.
Started the boycott. I put led by MLK slightly above the line because the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, Alabama had been planning the bus boycott for over a year.
Years.
And Dr. King did come in shortly after that and became the face of the movement. But the groundwork, the legwork that was put in was by women of color. I mean, just think about it. How do you organize an entire citywide boycott where everybody's still got to get to work if you just, somebody gets arrested and you're like, let's boycott?
It lasted 380 days.
380 days.
That doesn't happen without organizational structure, and that structure was put in place largely by the Women's Political Council.
She was actually 42 when she said
Yeah, she was 42.
She was 42. She was not an old woman. She was 42 and sprightly.
She was absolutely an activist, too.
Yeah.
She was trained at the Highlander School. The Highlander School still exists in Tennessee. You can go there today and be trained on nonviolence as a way of life and as an activist. She was trained at the Highlander School to be a nonviolent activist. She was radical in many ways and is often seen as passive in the stories we tell about history, which I think is also true of the way we talk about Dr. King and so many others through the movement. There's just a lot to learn about the truth behind really any racialized story in our past, but also in our current moment.
Yeah. And that I think what's important for me, and one thing I want to say that's the below the line thing, is when she made that decision, it was planned that they were going to have that. They've been looking ever since Claudette Colvin, which was mentioned, as a 15-year-old black woman who was very dark-skinned and was known to get into trouble and ended up, by the time they wanted to take it to court, was pregnant at the age of 17 by that point.
I don't remember that part.
Or 16 or 17 at that point. And they decided she couldn't be the face of the movement. That's not the face case we can use to convince people of this. They're just going to say, oh, she's this, she's that, whatever. Rosa Parks was part of the planning committee to have that come about. Yeah. That moment was not planned. She did make the decision because of a few things. And this is very simple. She was an angry black woman. Why? She wasn't sent by the NAACP to investigate the rape of a person, of a black woman. She, 4 days before this, attended a church service where they were informed by NAACP legal counsel that the 2 men responsible for the murder of Emmett Till had been exonerated. And as she got on the bus that night, the bus driver that was driving that bus had a nasty habit that many of the bus drivers had there, where they would force black patrons to get on the front, pay their fare, get off, and load at the back. But before they could get back on, drive off. This bus driver had done that to Rosa Parks 2 years before. And she had refused to get on his bus after that. But that night, she was ready. So there's a lot to it, as Luke said. There's a lot of things to these stories that we don't understand. And when we sanitize it enough to package it down into a nice little thing, and I get the need to have grade level conscious conversations with students. But when we get it to the point that that becomes the dominant narrative in our nation, we have some learning to do.
Yep. I see a hand.
Yes.
A second to.
No.
That moment when we learned that, maybe it was just now, but that moment when you learned that her contribution before that and that this was planned, 2 things when it happened to me was, of course. And then it's a paradigm shift totally to that this is about purposeful organization. And it changes your perspective of the history of that whole moment. I just, for what it's worth, wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and somebody had mentioned that she is one of the first civil rights activists we learn about. She is not the first civil rights activist, right? That's been going on for a long time. There's a lot of names that have been erased. All right, thank you for engaging in that activity as well. We're going to try to keep it lively for you.
Did that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, principle 4. I think we're on track with the numbering now.
Yeah.
Principle 4 is to follow. And we've mentioned this already, but there are people in the room who have been doing racial justice activism work for a really long time. And as a white educator, particularly a white male educator, one place to start if you're looking to engage is to find who the folks who are currently engaged are, either in your building, your local, state, at whatever level, and follow their lead. Get engaged with what they've been working on for many, many, many years. This also speaks to stepping outside of our typical role as the dominant voice in the room in our classrooms and following students' leads. One of the things I'm proud of, I think Terry would be too, is that we have an organization in our building that we call Bending the Arc, and it's a student-led social justice and activism club at Bellevue High School but they really set the agenda. They have their stories, their truths that they want to speak to in that space. They want to take the lead on actions that they can do in the building and in the community. And our role really in that is just to help facilitate what we can sort of behind the scenes. So following isn't just taking a backseat role to a national leader or a union leader. It might be that, but it also might be listening to what a student is experiencing and supporting that effort too, right? It kind of goes in a couple different directions.
Yeah, and I get, like, my mind would go to this as well. You know, in this room is probably the most diverse teaching space you get in all year. There are probably more teachers of color in this room right now than will be in any of your association meetings, staff meetings, or anything like that. So how do we follow that lead? One, Luke touched on, it's imperative to follow students. And I know that's counterintuitive. But when it comes to this work, they will tell you what they need. They show it every single day.
Yeah. This number is Utah teachers. 97% of Utah teachers are white. That's a national trend, though. We don't. Yeah.
83% nationwide are white.
Yeah, I think it's 91%?
or 2 in Washington.
Yeah.
And we also have an even more diverse student population that still isn't there.
Yeah. Our district is around 90% white educator force, but our students are about 50% white. So finding places where there is a chance to be a follower of students and other educators who are leaders of color in particular is really important as a white person who wants to try and engage in anti-racist activism.
And as educators, I think a lot of times being told to follow seems counterintuitive because at the same time I'm telling you to lead, right? But it's servant leadership, right? Not asking for the title, not asking for the position, but being willing to lead by your example, being vulnerable, putting yourself out there, putting yourself at risk, right? When we talk about following, you should be following those leaders, but you should be also willing to absorb the risk that comes with doing the work, the blowback. Because what happens a lot of times with our leaders of color in our districts is because they may be the only one, all racial tension flows to them. And they're asked to be the answer to those things, right? So I want you to follow their lead, but I don't want you to channel all of the racial tension that happens their direction. I want you to absorb some of that. That's a following position, right? Be the number two. Be the person that they can rely on. Be an ally, and even better, be an accomplice. Chelsea spoke to this already, so we're going to skip it. No, I'm just kidding. So space. This is, I think, a hard one to talk about. Chelsea introduced us in talking about space. I think she gives us more credit than we deserve for it. We were just really, I think, one, we were definitely trying to honor that we didn't feel like we belonged in that space, and that they did, and we wanted to hear. We were excited to hear about the work that they were doing, and we are cognizant. Like, I've sat in a meeting with an administrator, a teacher. He's a man, I'm a man, she's a woman, and I've just sat in that type of situation where she gets talked over, where I've had to physically turn my body to face her and acknowledge what she's saying to get him to stop doing that. In that space, I want to be aware of that, and I think all of us need to. So we're going to tell you a couple stories, because this is kind of a hard thing to explain except for through stories.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to acknowledge that we recognize the irony of taking all this space in here. But note that when you're working at a table group like this, for example, or if you're sitting with the leadership board at the union level or building level, be thinking in there where it's kind of a collective effort, where we're trying to hear lots of voices at the table. That's where this really applies, is in that setting. And being really conscious about how much space you're taking up. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there's a way to chart conversations that are happening at tables. You draw arrows from one direction to another for who's speaking and who's responding. And I don't want to tell this story with all the facts because I'd be saying people's names. There was a time when there was a gentleman who I've worked with for a little while who was known to take up a lot of space, and the conversation was charted and then later showed to him. And all of the arrows, first of all, it was very dark by his name because there were many of them and they were all going out different directions. And he was shown that and then quit the committee afterward. Like, oh, they're just attacking me. He really personalized that he was taking up too much space in the committee. So his way of thinking about that was to just get out of it. And so part of this too is to acknowledge, one, that you're taking up a lot of space, leave some for others, but then stay engaged when you're hearing things that you want to respond to without directly responding to it. You just keep listening for a bit, process for a while, make sure that the room for others to be heard is there, and you really do have the power to do that. You have the power to make a comment and take up more air. You also have the power to sit back and listen, and maybe if you need to respond later. And that leads us to these couple of stories.
I use that a tool in my class with Socratic seminars to just show students, right? We do a fishbowl seminar where a third of the class is in the middle discussing a couple questions, and I map it. It's how I track their participation, but it's also how I track who is taking up too much space and who's not taking up any. And how do we make sure that those voices get heard by minimizing those who would take up too much of it. So
I think this one's me.
This is you.
Terry mentioned earlier, but we had a wonderful opportunity in working with following the lead of some other community organizations in Seattle to take a group of 20, I think it was about 20, high school and early college age students to the south to visit some sites of the civil rights movement, the historic civil rights movement, and meet some folks. You know, people are still alive John Lewis, for crying out loud. There are many people who are still alive who marched the streets in that moment that we study as the civil rights movement. We went to meet with some of those folks on an opportunity where, you know, students didn't have to pay anything out of pocket. We got to prioritize some voices of color, young people of color, to go and have that experience, and it was really wonderful. But we were in a space talking about a history that was largely a black history. And we had this charter bus, Carlton, this wonderful man who drove our bus and probably taught us more than we taught the students, or that they taught us. And he'd let us come up and talk on the mic all throughout the trip. We drove from whatever, Nashville to Selma and Birmingham and Little Rock. It was this really cool thing. And along the way, we let students talk. And there was this one moment where a girl, she was not black, was processing a lot of things, and she was on the mic doing it. And she ended up we had about a 30-minute window of time. She ended up taking about 25 or almost close to that whole 30-minute window. And we were approached by some of the black students a little bit later about how they were really hoping to have an opportunity to share what they were going through in that experience. And the space had all been taken. So this is definitely something that we do. It's also something that can happen in our classrooms or in a learning environment as well. And so prioritizing your students of color and making sure that they have space to be heard, but without also making them feel on the spot is kind of this balance to strike with space. They don't have to speak to the whole story of being black. That's an expectation I think we often have as white educators, center race in that. That's also not fair, but then to allow the space for when the voices do want to be heard is also really important too. And we didn't do a good enough job of managing that on this particular experience. It's one of the learnings we have that led to that being a part of this discussion.
And a person of color may be in that space and choose not to share. But the goal of this, of acknowledging space and being aware of it, is to never have a person of color leave that conversation feeling like they didn't share because they weren't provided the opportunity to. And so making sure that they have that opportunity to speak. So we were in Boston, and we had the privilege to have quite a few amazing guest keynote speakers. One of them, Toshi, is an artist. She's a spoken word artist, as well as she does kind of blues, just blues?
It's like spoken word blues.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. Like she
really
got up on the
beautiful.
mic during a lunch, and we were all eating, and we're listening to her, and just this seamless segue between talking to you and then entering into singing blues. It was phenomenal. But she said something at one point, right? And we need to acknowledge that at that moment, that was her space. We were observants, but she had the mic. Woman of color, LGBTQ, had the mic and was sharing her truth. And she said something about the current administration that rubbed somebody the wrong way. And a white woman thought that it was appropriate to challenge that space by shouting out that she supported the president. Now, you have every right to, in this country, to support whoever you want. You have your reasons for doing that. But what we're talking about in this is this space was this conference on racial and social justice. It was more than any space I've ever been in, centering the experiences and perspective of people of color. And because of the tension and discomfort that one person felt, she shattered that space. Talking to people of color about that afterwards, of what that was like. Now, Toshi handled it. She said, hey, that's your truth, that's your perspective. Right now I'm telling mine. She continued, tried to say something else, and kind of said, I got the mic right now. So nobody needed to get up and say anything. But I use it to illustrate that in these moments when we're talking about racial justice, if you're experiencing that discomfort, and don't center your feelings in the conversation. It is not about what you are going through in that conversation. If we're having a discussion about why so many of our young black men in high school are getting expelled, and then somebody makes a comment about classroom policies that contribute to it, and you have those classroom policies, and you feel such discomfort that you want to center the conversation about your feelings about that and your rationalization and justification for that, which is probably fine and legitimate. But you're centering your own self in that space. Always be aware of how much room you're taking up.
Right. It's not the same as being silent.
It's not being silent.
Yeah,
and
I'm not saying that.
Chelsea and Harry challenged us on that, right? It's almost as if we were writing that line of disengaging rather than providing space. So, it doesn't mean that you can't share. It just means be aware. Have it in your mind.
6?
Yep.
All right, making our way. The sixth principle is accountability. And this is where stay engaged is so important. It's one of the things we started with. It's one of the, the principles that the Pacific Education Group's Courageous Conversations Protocols is based on. And it's probably one of the hardest things, especially as a white male. I kind of check every box of the things, right? It's really easy for me to step out. And I do that. But it's important that we not do that. We need to stay engaged and stay accountable to the work as best we can and catch ourselves in the moments where we find it easier to step out than to stay in the discussion, to stay in the active work that it takes to undo anti-racist structures.
Baby, I got it.
I know. I kind of needed that.
Yeah, and just like Luke was saying, what keeps me going and involved in this work constantly is that fact that I can escape. I can leave. I cannot ever run another staff PD about race in our school. I could never speak on this issue in different states or whatever. I could stop and I could teach and I could be a great teacher. And my kids will grow up and live a normal, fine life. But what keeps me into it is just because I can check out and disengage and I won't see. Now, I would argue there are actually negative consequences of growing up in a world that does not solve this for everybody. But as far as what I get from society, that doesn't change. But it does for our students of color. Our students of color cannot simply just end this conversation and move on with their lives. They can't say, I'm just feeling really stressed about all this and, not feeling like I'm doing it right. I think I'm just going to, focus on my teaching this year and not talk about anything that's going to get anybody riled up and in my office and all that stuff, right? They can't do that because their status quo decreases when they disengage from that, when they stop fighting. And it also decreases when we stop fighting, but we don't feel it. We don't absorb that. They do. And so that's what keeps me accountable, is that idea, and I welcome my colleagues of color. Luke and I serve as kind of idea partners to keep one another accountable to doing this work. Self-care, absolutely. But just don't make sure that your self-care is predicated on letting these systems of oppression continue.
Yeah. I had a thought and it went away. I hate that.
If I press forward and backwards,
it was
enough times.
There it is again. Yeah. We mentioned this, I don't know if we mentioned this in this setting yet, but we think of equity work as building muscle, building equity muscle. It's a process and it's painful. Oftentimes it's personal, it hurts. Emotionally, not in the way that a physical workout might hurt physically. History shows us that it may hurt you physically though too. And so we use the analogy of a lifting partner, a spotter, in trying to understand accountability as well. You can help to hold others accountable, not just yourself, by helping them carry the weight sometimes if they need it. If you're noticing that they're struggling with the weight, bump up the bar a little bit. And that takes an intentional effort. You've got to be aware of what's going on in the work around you and notice when someone else, Terry's really good at this with me, inviting me into something. So be somebody else's spotter and try to find your spotter too is a nice way to kind of frame the idea of holding people personally accountable for the work too.
And if you've ever been part of any type of sports team or you've worked out and you've had that spotter, you know it's not just about making it more comfortable for them. It's about pushing them, about challenging them, right? I used to weightlift a lot and bench press, right? Like if I have a spotter that when I start to struggle, grabs that bar and helps lift it up, that's not helping me. I need somebody who's there that I know, I'm not going to die when this drops, but is also saying, you got this, you can do it, keep pushing, going through. Right? So that's why we really love that spotting analogy, because the accountability is not just about making it more comfortable and making you feel better about what you're doing. It's about pushing you to do your best and to get better every time. Amplify. All right. This, okay. All right. So we're going to do a group activity again. Let's see. You can turn over the Rosa Parks sheet, or if you have a scrap piece of paper. Okay. But what I want each group to do is I want you to write down everything you encounter on a daily basis that is designed for right-handed people. I will give you a sample just to start. In your classroom, the scissors are most likely designed to go into your right hand. Okay? That one's free on me. You're welcome. Go ahead and start writing everything else that is designed for right-handed people. Let's see what we got. There's a lot of writing going on. So we have desks. Okay, especially maybe if you have the old-fashioned desks. I was at a room in University of Washington for a debate tournament, and they all had those old-school desks that have like the little wooden piece that comes on the side for your arm. What happens if you're left-handed? Okay. The handicap button, driving, the stick shift I heard over here as well. Yeah, manual, the door handles, stand-up tables, the paper cutter, the mouse on a computer, cell phones, absolutely. Okay, gear shift. Oh, elbows at the, that was elbows at the dinner table. If you guys were all sitting right now around the table and somebody's left-handed, they just threw off the whole groove. Okay. What else do we have? Binders and notebooks, right? The way that that's set up is for right-handed people. Credit card swipe machines, gas nozzles. What else do we got?
We got the mouse.
Mouse, yeah, we have.
Yeah, drinking fountains.
Veggie peelers. Over here, I saw one that, or back here, I saw one that can lead to your death. Circular saws. Chainsaws. Okay. Pant zippers. Sewing machines? Baseball mitts, yeah, absolutely. Musical instruments are designed. All right. So please raise your hand if you are right-handed.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead and put that down. Please raise your hand if you are left-handed. All right. You failed your left-handed counterparts. Okay.
Yeah, Barb.
So,
ambidextrous?
Now,
difference.
some people do both,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, sometimes they're left-handed, sometimes they're right-handed, different activities. There's some people that are fully ambidextrous, but what we just picked up in here, and what we're going to use this to go into, is the concept of privilege. Because privilege, oftentimes when people talk about white privilege, that is a discomfort level that many people want to check out of. Because they've experienced life with hardship. Just because I'm white doesn't mean I'm privileged. I was a teen parent. I grew up in poverty. I flunked out of college the first time. Don't tell me I'm privileged. I worked for everything I did. Yes, you did. I did. But right-handed privilege. You navigate a society that is designed predominantly for right-handed people. Now, is there rationale for that? Most people are right-handed. If you're looking from a strictly economic capitalist perspective, that's what makes money. Left-handed people, how many people, percentage of the room was left-handed? Under 10%. So if I want to sell a product, am I making my chainsaws right or left-handed? Right. Now, sure, nowadays we're getting to markets. There are left-handed chainsaws. There are left-handed musical instruments. There are left-handed baseball mitts. But society as a whole is designed for people that are right-handed. So as we get in and talk about privilege in a moment, I want you to keep that in mind. That's something that doesn't make us uncomfortable. Guess what? It's not your fault if you're right or left-handed. You didn't choose, most likely, whether you're right or left-handed. You may have worked hard to become ambidextrous. Some people in this room even remember a time when they would tape your hand to the desk to force you to write right-handed. Okay? And that's a whole different level of issues there. But when we're talking about privilege, what we're talking about is something that we are born with, and society favors or benefits us because we were born that way. And consequently, may hurt others. Sometimes it could just be an annoyance, right? If you're left-handed, one thing here or there may be an annoyance. Using a chainsaw could kill you, right? And when we make this parallel to race, sometimes being a person of color and dealing with this aspect of white privilege is just annoying, right? You could say, sometimes I share some of the things. When you go to buy a Band-Aid at the store, whose skin tone does it match? Okay. Yeah, okay. More match. Right? Like some people, I say something like that and they're like, oh, come on, like that's not a real issue. Sure, it might be an annoyance to you. It may have a very profound impact on somebody else, but it may be just an annoyance to you. But I want you to add that up every single day of your life. What impact does that have on you? And just like that left-handed chainsaw, it is still possible in this country to die because of that. Because you are black or brown, non-white. So as we get into this, I want you to keep the left-handed privilege. That is our nicest way possible to introduce you to the concept in a way that we can all understand. It's nobody's fault about being right-handed or left-handed. Nobody intentionally maybe designed everything to work that way, but it is how it works. So please keep that in mind.
So the way the concept of amplify relates to that.
Do you want to do that?
Sure.
Want to flip the script? Okay.
Sure. Okay,
So,
yeah.
yeah, all right. So we're going to flip the script a little bit and show you, if you've benefited from right-handed privilege your whole life, now you're not going to. You have 30 seconds in a moment to write something for me. You are going to write it with your left hand in cursive. Now, I wrote this morning and timed it, and I did it in 25 seconds. So you only have, I did it right-handed.
Right-handed.
But you have 30 seconds to write the phrase, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This is a contest. There will be winners and losers. Go. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Toward the bottom of the screen.
Cursive. It has to be in cursive with your left hand. Everybody's doing it with their left hand. Even left-handed people.
I got it, Terry. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
How much time we got left? How much time we got left? You got time?
I got it, yeah. 10 seconds.
10 seconds. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
4, 3,
2, 1. Pins down. Nope, pins down. Put it. All right. We want you. Okay. We want you to pick a winner. Look at the table. Look at the table. I want you to pick a winner for penmanship. Whose writing looks the nicest with this quote?
Should have brought prizes. Huh? We should have brought prizes. We should have brought prizes.
Oh yeah, I got mints. I'll throw them. You get a business card. Okay. Please, if you are a winner, stand up. All right.
Who won at your tables?
If you are a winner and left-handed, please raise your hand. Okay. All right, you got another one over here? All right. Right-handed people, was that fair? No! Why wasn't it fair? You were all asked to complete the same task. This is equality. Time tests aren't fair. Yeah, that's a whole nother issue. But did not everybody have 30 seconds? Everybody had the phrase written up here for you to do it. Why wasn't it fair? This is what when we get into the privilege, right? Flipping the script, being able to understand what it's like to deal with privilege. It's not anybody's fault that they were left-handed, and the people who were left-handed, some of them didn't win because they still didn't have good penmanship. So just because they had left-handed privilege in that exercise, where the rules were set to favor them, did not mean that they all were successful. And just because you had right-handed oppression in that exercise, did not mean that everybody couldn't make it, because we had right-handed people win that competition. So goes for race in our country, right? Do you want to pick up?
All right, so I'll just read this. It's important to acknowledge when you have privilege and to use that privilege to amplify voices of color that don't have the same access you do. So amplifying a voice of color is a way to use your privilege. We, as a white man in a space, I often am allowed to speak without being questioned or spoken over. I can use my privilege, going back to one of our other principles, to allow for more space. We're not trying to get you to be the savior here. That's not our role. There are people who know how to do the work and want to do the work. We just want you to think about how historically we've always had the microphone. And in this way, we can, to use the phrase of amplify, we can amplify somebody else's voice by thinking about our privilege and allowing them to be heard in a space where they might not historically have been heard. This also means sometimes that the consequences of engaging in social justice work at a school level need to be shared. And I think that's related to privilege too. It's easy for us to deflect some of the challenges that come along with engaging in racial equity work, and to allow for voices of color, people of color who we work with, to absorb that. that can silence them. That can be a tool that's used, it is a tool that's used by folks who push back against racial equity work to try and silence those who are engaged in it. And another way to amplify the voices of color who have been doing the work for a long time and are engaged is to find ways to absorb some of that pushback so that their voice may continue to be heard. It's another important element of using our privilege. There's probably less at risk for us. I'm probably less likely to get fired than somebody else who is of color. I'm probably more likely to be able to get another job if I do get fired, where they might not be. That's another way that we might use our privilege. My name, Luke Mitchner, doesn't get thrown in the recycle bin when it's looked at on a resume. When someone's name, who might be hard for me to pronounce, does. And a lot of that, and we know that that is true. That has been studied. I'm not making this up, that just the name on a resume is enough for it to be put in a recycle bin sometimes. And so if I can absorb some of what people of color have been absorbing for hundreds of years, and use my privilege in that way to allow their voice to continue to be amplified, knowing that I take on less risk. That's another way of thinking about what amplify really means. I see a hand and want to make sure that we acknowledge that. Thank you.
Sometimes you don't want to share your story because sometimes you don't want people to ask you too many questions. I share my story with my close friends, or, you know, after I get to know them a little bit. But not always do I want to share everything, because if I share a little bit, you know, and it could be that they just are interested, but, you know, the question is always like, oh, you know, where are you from? And sometimes I just don't feel like sharing, and I don't feel like being asked those questions, because I might not feel comfortable with that person, or it might not be relevant to, you know, where we are. So, you know, there's times when I don't want to share. I just sort of want to, you know, listen and kind of see what other people think and what other people say. It doesn't mean that I'm not allowed. I'm fortunate that I have some really good friends and support that support me in that. But, you know, it's always sort of depends on the situation and the people that you're with. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your truth. Appreciate that. And that is, I think, another place when we were talking about amplifying is a person may not want to share everything, but they shared it with you. And so when an issue comes about that you feel passionate about, and you've shared something with me, you don't have to share it with everybody. And I should not share it with anybody unless I've received permission to do so. But I can amplify the idea and the support. This is an association. Amplify is not a foreign concept for you. Okay? We know in associations about amplifying, we know that there is strength in numbers. And when the numbers of educators in our country is vastly wide, we need white educators to unite for the concerns of our students and our colleagues of color. All right.
This is 7?
Number
8?
8.
8, okay.
So
8,
act.
8 is act. We've faced criticism a lot recently about taking a political position as educators. But I want to say to you that teaching is a political act. Amen. We are public educators. And to stay neutral in a status quo that is unfair is a choice that you make that is also a political choice. That is a decision. And to not remain neutral, to act, is also a political choice. It is politics is about power, is about who makes decisions, is about the way a group, a society, a school operates, and daily we make decisions that are political acts. Our tardy policy is a political act. Our uniform policy at schools is a political act. Does the hijab have to match the pants? Is a political act. Are we neutral in that discussion, or do we hold a position? Do we take a stance that tries to use the privilege that we've talked about to honor what we've learned about the voices of color and use our position there to take action that's more equitable?
We're sitting at a table of colleagues sitting there, and a person makes a comment to your colleague of color that, you know, your hair really looks ghetto. And we're professionals, and I really think that your hair, you should change the way that you do your hair to make it look more professional. And you heard that, and you're sitting there. You have a choice in that moment. And not acting and not saying something is a political choice, is a political act, right? It is either reinforcing a status quo of power or challenging the status quo of power. And what we have learned through many times failing to act, right? Personal, me, not acting, not showing up for my students, not showing up for my colleagues. I've learned that simply not acting is unacceptable.
Now, one thing that gets confused, I think, in that dialogue is when we talk about teaching as a political act is that we pit Republicans against Democrats. And that's not at all what we're saying. We're not saying that only Democrats are the ones who might take a position that supports a student or a colleague of color or that works toward equity in schools. It's not about that at all. Those discussions, debates between Republicans and Democrats have gone back and forth over the course of our history. What we're speaking to is discussions about acting in a way that promotes equity in schools, and that doesn't have to align with a particular party. That has to align with understanding the realities that students of color are facing in our schools and taking action to try and work toward a more equitable education experience for those students. We don't mean to paint that in red and blue brushes at all. And that's where a lot of the criticism we face, especially recently, personally, comes from. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about teaching as a political act. It's about who has the power to make decisions and using that power in a way that is equitable for our students.
No, I just want to make a small comment on, I agree with everything you're saying in terms of students of color, but I'd also like to add students in the LGBT community. There are also students that are non-Christian, students in the state maybe who may be non-Mormon. That can happen to groups of beyond just the ones we're mentioning.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that is absolutely true. And a very important part of this work is intersectionality of identity, right? That a person is not just black or is not just white. We all have multiple identities that intersect and clash and can face pushback and blowback for. And yeah, we would never pretend that that's not the case. But I do have a firm belief that in the history of our nation, that race has played a very special role. And that by addressing it from an anti-racist approach, we can get to those other intersections. Because within the LGBTQ community, the difference between if you are white and black still plays a role. Within the disabled community, the difference of whether you are white and black still plays a role. Now, I absolutely agree with you, and thank you for bringing that to our attention. That is the focus. We want to address the needs of all of our students, and I believe that this is a segue into that work.
One more thing too, and that is that it doesn't have to be just a white person that corrects. No. It can also be a person of color. As an example, there was a problem in our staff lounge yesterday where a teacher said to another teacher, her first name begins with K and her last name begins with K, and he looked at her, he said, does your middle initial begin or your middle name begin with K? And I looked at that teacher and I said to him, I said, you do realize that was inappropriate, right? And he looked at me and he said, oh. So it does not have to be someone, you know, anybody can do it.
Yeah, and thank you. I think that gets right up to the top of this list of ways that you may act. And it may just be a personal interaction at that level. That is action. That is, a lot of folks, I've mentioned this earlier, ask, what can we do to start? It's those kinds of interactions that are the best way to start. Making the decision to interrupt. Sorry. Yeah, you go.
There's no act that's too small, right?
Yeah.
When we're getting going in this work and you're seeking to act, you're like, I want to do something about it, then do it. You don't have to get onto a platform and put together a massive PD. You can get there. We eventually got there, right? But the point is to consistently try to interrupt these systems, right? And that could be in your mind of how you think, noticing what you see. You see somebody, you make an assumption in your mind. You don't vocalize it so nobody knows, but you know. And then you challenge that, and you sit in that, and you wonder, why did my mind go there? Why did I make that assumption? That is an act. Saying something when a colleague says something or a student says something. One of the #1 complaints from our students of color in our building is that teachers do not care when other kids use the N-word. They do not correct them. They just assume that, you know, this is it's youth culture, it's hip hop culture, you know, they're saying it not to be mean, they're just saying it. But one of the #1 complaints from our students of color is that there is no correction done. That's an act, right? But what I think, if we're going to really get into this work and really start to move the needle on racial justice in our schools, then we have to have a multi-pronged approach. Yes, absolutely, the journey starts within you, right? It was spoken to beautifully earlier. It's got to be an issue of your heart that you want to do, that you want to change. In your building, what is your building doing? Does your building have a racial equity team or just an equity team? If not, start one. Get some teachers together to focus on these issues of equity. Offer PDs for your colleagues. Try to bring in people for it. Learn yourself, right? Start a book club. You guys want a book? Get Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. All of you in your small group, read it and talk about it. That's an act. Your district. If your district is not talking about equity and you have a voice in that, you have a personal relationship with the superintendent, you know the curriculum developers, start those conversations. You may be you may be surprised. You can end up being both the district's darling and the person that they dread when they see an email come in, right? Because you're pushing this work. But the point is to keep pushing. And never, never, never leave out the community. I think this was talked about earlier, about this idea that there's a disconnect. We were having a conversation about housing prices and how I don't live in my district and he doesn't live in our district and many of you don't live in districts. If you live in places, you get priced out. That's a disconnect from our community. We have to involve our community in this process. Excuse me. If we try to do this without the community, I guarantee you will face far more backlash, right? Having these types of workshops, having those conversations with the community of like, hey, I know, start with that assumption, I know that you want every single one of our students to have an equitable education opportunity. So how can we do that together? Bring them on board. And then in your union, you guys have already started, we're here, okay? And, well, wasn't trying to be, yeah. That wasn't an applause break, but thank you. You know, people within this union nominated Chelsea for the work that she's doing for this great work, right? So there are already things going on. But I do challenge you to think about as a whole. Is the UEA and equity synonymous? Is the UEA, as it's operating now, and racial equity in schools, do those go together? Do your members know that? Do they know that the NEA has chosen racial equity as one of our primary focuses? If you're a union president, are you communicating that to your people? Are you dealing with the pushback? what can you do? You want to talk about Andrew Young?
Yeah, so we got this idea. Andrew Young is a civil rights activist from the civil rights movement. He worked with Dr. King, he was a little bit younger, worked directly with Dr. King on a couple of occasions. And we have a colleague in our district, his name's Christian Page, who we learned about Andrew Young through, so I want to acknowledge Christian as well, who's a wonderful leader in equity. And he told us the story of Andrew Young telling him a story. So we're going to probably mess that up because the telephone game doesn't go well.
Relay the story.
But I think the idea will hold true. And he told us about a personal discussion with Andrew Young, where Andrew Young talked about the ability to affect the 3 feet around you. So just look 3 feet around you in all directions. Up's probably not that helpful. But left and right is probably pretty good. And I want you to imagine that in the 3 feet around you, you might have a piece of technology, you might have a person, you might have a pen and paper. You've got things right around you right now that you can take action on that will have a ripple effect, that will then continue. A discussion that you have, an email that you send, a book that you read is right there right now. And that conversation, that knowledge that you've gained, the message that you've passed on doesn't disappear when it's over. Right? The message may go somewhere else. The knowledge may go somewhere else. The person might take an action that builds toward the work. So when we feel overwhelmed about the union or the community or the district, which is overwhelming, oh my goodness, there's so much. Zoom back in on the 3 feet around you and think about what's there. What can you do in the immediate that's right within your grasp that may build toward those larger objectives?
All right. The 9th principle is grow. In this work, let's go back to the weightlifting metaphor. You haven't been to the gym in a while, and if you all look up here, you will see Exhibit A.
I just took a drink of water before you said that, and almost...
You missed the spit take.
Almost came out.
Okay, you haven't been to the gym in a while. If I go get on that treadmill, how am I feeling the next day? Really sore, really uncomfortable. Makes me want to stay home, not go back to the gym that day. Okay? If that's how we get in this work, then it will never be successful. Right? I will never run a marathon if every time I feel discomfort going to the gym, I stop going. And in this work, it is so important to be, I didn't know we were starting the beatbox section.
That's happening.
In this work, it's so important to, stay engaged and to be willing to grow. There's a concept out there by Robin DiAngelo that she's a white woman, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And I'm going to say it anyway. It's called white fragility. And the concept of white fragility, just like white privilege rubs people the wrong way, is that white people in this country, which I know is stereotyping the whole group, but the norm, the average response is that white people are very fragile when it comes to these discussions about race. And when we talk about fragility, that means they're easy to disengage from it if they experience any level of discomfort. And we're going to tell a couple stories about our own growth, but what I hope you notice is that no matter what, when you're engaged in a racial dialogue about these issues, when you're having that heated staff meeting about hoods, whether hoods can be on your students and people start saying all that, and somebody brings up the point of like, this is a racial issue, and it makes you really uncomfortable and you want to quit from it, and they maybe even call out and say your policy about hoods and hats is racist, and it disproportionately affects our students of color, and they're getting disciplined, and that's harming them, and you feel I'm harming them. That discomfort that you're experiencing is nowhere near the level of pain and discomfort that those students of color are feeling. Yours may be intense for you in that moment. It may happen semi-frequently, but it is not a persistent thing. I think about, anytime I complain about being in pain, my wife kindly reminds me that she pushed 2 children out of her. Okay? So yes, I am in pain in that moment, but my level of discomfort is not approaching what she experienced. Now imagine if she was giving birth every day. right? So when we talk about grow, we're talking about resisting that desire to let our feelings interfere with progress. We have to grow. We got called to the floor by students. While we were on that trip, Seattle to Selma, life-changing experience, it's fantastic. Also, don't know if I'd want to do it again. Because it was really, really uncomfortable. We had a conversation one night late. That was the other thing about this, is every night the organizers ended up staying up till like 3 in the morning arguing about the day. And we were all exhausted. And one night we were staying up late, and we were trying to talk to one of our colleagues about the behavior of the black students on the trip. And from what we were seeing, we're anti-racist, right? We're trying to be aware of all that. But we were seeing disrespectful behavior. And it wasn't just those students, but it felt like it was becoming an issue between students and between members on the organizing team. And the black man that was part of our organizing team, as we're talking about this, finally had reached his limit, and he told us his truth of how he saw us hyper-surveilling those students, assuming the worst about those students, monitoring those students, looking over their shoulder while they're texting, all these different things that were making them feel even more uncomfortable. And he reminded us that this isn't about learning something for them. This is about their very survival. As they're learning about the civil rights movement and what happened. When we went to the site where a man was lynched and collected soil for Equal Justice Initiative, this is about their survival, not about their comfort. And he reminded us of that, and it shook me. We got through, I didn't say anything else. I disengaged. I was there, but I disengaged. I went to bed very late, got about 3 hours of sleep, and I woke up and I was not ready to be there. I got on the bus, I went to the back, I didn't say anything to anybody. I sat in one of the back rows, had my hood on, put earphones in, and I disengaged, and I was sulking. And I had the great privilege of having a student come up to me at the next stop and challenge me and say, you know what? I heard that some stuff went down with the adults yesterday. You don't have the right to disengage from this. You helped organize this. You brought us here. You asked us to be uncomfortable. And you are being weak. And it was weird hearing that from a 16-year-old man. But it also, going back to follow, listening to that student, I was able to kind of come out of that, and rather than feel like, you know what, I was trying so hard, I put so much of my sweat, tears, time into this. Do you realize I've only gotten like 10 hours of sleep in the last week? And to have somebody criticizing that, he reminded me, it's not about me. And that was my opportunity to either grow or to quit. And I'm grateful that I chose to grow after getting called to task about it.
We've been talking a lot.
Yes.
Sorry. I had a similar experience with a student that I'll share briefly, an opportunity to grow. I teach a government class, government and politics, and in my class we're learning about executive agencies. We're learning about the support systems that are there in the executive branch to help focus on particular issues. The Department of Education is a department. We learned about the FCC, the Communications Commission, all these different things. And I asked kids to invent an agency so that they might, think at an application level about what these agencies do and issues that they might get engaged in. And then we did a kind of a share out of the agencies they created. And a young white male student, these are seniors, he's probably 17 or 18, in a room where, in our school, we've got about 55% white population. I think this class was probably pretty representative of that. There were a couple of black students. We have a lot of Asian Pacific Islander students. That's roughly 30%. And then 10% or so Latinx. I don't remember exactly the numbers, but they're kind of right around there. And I think the room was fairly well represented in that way. This young white student had created an executive agency that he called, in order to study physical fitness in youth, like the Ballin' Black Boys Bureau. And he said that as a joke, he's like, to get a rise out of his classmates. Probably didn't think of it as much coming from his perspective. And as the teacher in the room, I just kind of shook it off. Just was like, okay, we'll go to the next one. Didn't really say anything in the moment. Maybe I didn't even fully recognize what that might have meant to some of the students of color in the room. And the next day, before class, a young black woman who was in that class said something to me. She said, "I can't believe you didn't say anything. I can't believe you didn't tell so-and-so when he said Ballin' Black Boys Bureau that's not appropriate. Like, that's not okay. We can't stereotype." Like, she went on and on about how uncomfortable that made her feel. And I know that from that moment on in my class that day, she didn't learn anything. That was really, really hard to hear. I felt like I had failed. This is just last year. I've been doing anti-racist education work for 2 years at this point. I'm trying to engage in my building at the district, student organizations. There's these things we're trying to do, and I've got a kid who just tells me I dropped the ball. I failed. I did it wrong. She was hurt. Yeah, that really sucks. But then, you know, what now? What now? Do I just stop? Right? What do I do with that information? I invited her to lunch. She and I had lunch together later I think it was the next week. We just had a good conversation. We talked for a little while. I tried to get to know her a little bit better. And I also, the next day, had a conversation with that student who had initially said something. It was too little, but it wasn't too late. I still had an opportunity, and I took it. It would have been more impactful in the moment. But I have since had other opportunities like it. And from the moment I had an opportunity for growth, have tried to be more direct in engaging in the classroom when those kinds of things happen. They happen all the time. Terry told you that one of the things our black students are concerned about, and we collected data on this to our building's credit. We asked students how they were feeling about this thing. And black students were telling us that they don't like that our teachers are so silent when they're hearing racialized language. We found that out this year in some data we collected. And so in thinking about growth, we've got to get to a point where we acknowledge where we've failed, where we've dropped the ball, where we haven't met the standard we're talking about in an equitable education experience, but then change going forward. And that's what the growth is.
And part of growth, just to close this out and transition us into the last principle, which we are almost done, is don't tone police your students or your colleagues when they approach you where you messed up. Right? We get into this habit of, like, you know, you're going to come at me like that, you're angry, or yelling, or you use, you know, swearing or something, like, I'm just going to shut down, I'm not going to listen to you, because the way you're telling me, I'm not willing to accept. We got to stop that. Yeah, could they be more effective? That's sure. And that's a conversation you can have later. But in that moment, when you stop them from sharing their truth, because the way they're doing it is making you uncomfortable, you are not displaying a growth mindset in that area. Which leads us to our last and final principle, which may look familiar. Listen. When we started this, we started off with listen because it's how we got involved in this work, and it is the foundational way in which we've learned everything that we have, is by listening. But it's also our end. We bookend it like this because you can never stop listening. At every phase of this work, you should be listening to people that are most affected by it. And to be 100% frank, I'm so grateful that you guys brought me here. But if this association, this state, and the teachers in this room were effective at listening to their colleagues of color, we wouldn't need to be here. And I don't say that to be mean. I don't say that to make anybody feel guilty. I say that because this is how we choose to amplify, is to have these conversations with educators that are white, because a lot of times they're more willing to listen to us. I had a situation just a few weeks ago, a couple months now, where there's a student-led group that was talking about sexual assault in the Me Too campaign. And The young women were running it. There's a couple young men that were part of the group. They were friends. They're not opposed. They have different ideas. But in that meeting, the young men kept interrupting and interrupting and interrupting the women as they were trying to present, asking questions, challenging points, all of those things. It got to a point where it was so obvious that my female colleague who was in the room decided to say something. And then they started arguing with her. And at that point, since I was in the room and it didn't seem like anything was doing, I chose to speak. I had been trying to give the space to those women to lead that conversation. But at that point, a person was using their privilege in the room to silence the other individuals. And so I chose to speak. And I shared with them why I thought they needed to be more aware of how they were talking, how they were using body language, voice tone to silence the women that were in there, interrupting. And when I got done, they silently nodded their heads and stayed quiet. And one of my fierce young women activists immediately pointed out, "Did you notice you did that for him? And we've been asking you to do it the entire period." That's why we're here. I thank you for listening, for engaging, for being a part of this. But to go from the 1st all the way to the 10th, please, we're not going to be here anymore. We catch a flight in the morning. Listen to your students. Listen to your colleagues.
Yeah, and we'll close by saying that we've only done this a few times.
The full thing, yeah.
Yeah, the full thing. I think this is the 3rd time we've gone through all of them in detail. And inevitably afterward, I don't expect this to happen, that's not what I'm saying, but I've had afterward people of color, women of color in particular, come to me and say thank you for the listening piece in particular, because they've felt as though in professional settings they have not been heard, even if they've been speaking. And so I think one thing to take away as a white educator, particularly a white male educator, is to also show that you've listened. People need to know that they've been heard. And you show that in a couple of ways. You can acknowledge people with body language, verbal cues, good questioning. What's one of the the questions you were asking in those discussions earlier, or mindful inquiry, thinking about how we might engage someone to get more ideas out from them. That's how we show we're listening, and we're also learning more from them. But you also show you've listened by the actions that you take. If you've listened to a colleague who've expressed a concern that's grounded in racial equity work in your schools, and then you don't do anything about what you've heard, they'll feel unheard. And so I think one of the key takeaways from all of this is to show that you've been listening by the way that you respond immediately, but also by the actions that you take afterward.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, and we'll also stick around.
Maybe we'll just end it that way. We'll stick around if you'd like to have some more conversations.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
If you'd like our contact information, we do have cards up here that has our home email and cell phone numbers. Try to, if you have anything else or something later that pops up and you want to contact us, that's available.
Hang on 1 second. You're not going anywhere. Is this on? Thank you. I am thinking about the role that our association plays in this work and how the UEA can be the vehicle by which we unite together and have opportunities to fulfill the promise of public education for all of our students, particularly our students of color. And our UEA can be our spotter and our opportunity to lift this work up. And I'm thinking too about the enormous challenge that we have in Utah to have our teaching force reflect the diversity of our students, and how that isn't going to happen on its own, and how that's going to take action on our part, which is a part of the minority plan for the UEA that was submitted to NEA and approved. Denise shared it with our Council of Local Presidents today. It's an enormous undertaking that is different from any other minority involvement plan that we have had in the past. It's not perfect, but it's only a piece of paper unless it becomes action. And one of the deliberate actions is that direct attention on recruiting educators of color so that we have people in our classrooms who are reflective of our teaching population. And from there, we have a membership in our association that is reflective of the teaching population. And then from there, we have leaders who in our association who are reflective of our membership. And it's not going to happen on its own. So let today be that experience that creates the ripple effect. You know, we've got our 3 feet of influence and an incredible opportunity and an inspiration today. So I couldn't thank you guys more. We do have kind of a little symbolic gift with more to come. But, you know, it wouldn't be coming to Utah without some green Jell-O and some fry sauce.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
So I too am from Washington State. In fact, I went to high school there, not very far away from where they teach now. I have to say, I'm astounded to hear the statistics of Bellevue High School, because when I was there, that was about as lily white as it could be. And to be 50% diverse is pretty awesome, you know, that's coming together. We would also like to offer you a small thing, but a sweatshirt of your choice, be it BYU, Utes, Park City Mountain Resort, Alta. You know, what are some of our other awesome Utah State. So we'll be following up with you too. And I know it's small for what you've given up. I mean, we think about burnout and exhaustion. Think of what they've given to come here. It's such a gift.
Chelsea,
it's such a gift. So, thank you.
Glendale? Can we get a couple Glendale Middle School sweatshirts? Glendale Middle School sweatshirts?
Yes, Glendale Middle School tours.
All right.